The life of Victoria, Princess Royal and German Empress. Victoria was the eldest child of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She was born on the 21st of November 1840. Her parents had hoped for a son and heir and were disappointed when their first child was a girl. Even the doctor that delivered the baby knew of the disappointment her birth would cause when he announced to the Queen that she had given birth to a daughter. Upon hearing that they had a daughter, the Queen remarked, "Don't worry, the next one will be a boy." Victoria was lovingly called Vicky by her family for the rest of her life. Though Victoria did love her daughter, her relationship with Vicky was distant, perhaps due to Victoria's own upbringing. Albert quickly devised an educational regime for his daughter. Vicky went to great lengths to please her parents and grew up to be an intelligent young woman on par with her father's intellect. Vicky learned everything from mathematics to philosophy and became very liberal in her thinking. From the age of 18 months, she began to learn French, and at the age of 4, she was fluent in both French and German. From a young age, Vicky's parents searched for a suitable husband for their daughter. Prince Frederick William of Prussia was chosen, and Vicky met him for the first time at the Great Exhibition in 1851. Eager to impress, Vicky made a good impression on the prince, and the pair remained in contact when the prince returned to Prussia, sending letters to each other. 4 years later, in 1855, Frederick returned to Britain and asked for the young princess's hand in marriage. At 15, she was too young to marry, and her parents asked that they wait until Vicky was 17. The Prussian court were outraged at the marriage proposal, believing the British monarchy to be weak as a constitutional monarchy. They also did not think that the Princess Royal was a suitable match for the future King of Prussia. The British press were also not a fan of the groom either. Vicky's own mother worried that her daughter was not beautiful and tall enough for the prince, but she needn't have worried. The pair were in love. For the next 2 years, the wedding details were finalized, with much arguments between the two families. Vicky wanted to bring 2 of her ladies-in-waiting with her to Prussia, but she was refused by her future in-laws. The Prussian royal family demanded that as the groom's family, they should have the final say in the wedding matters. They believed that the couple should wed in Prussia, but Queen Victoria was never one to not get her way and refused to allow the couple to wed outside Britain. Despite all the fighting in the families, Vicky and Frederick did have a fairy tale wedding in St. James's Palace on the 25th of January 1858. As the bride of a foreign prince, Vicky was to move to Prussia after the wedding. Though a wonderful start to their married life, things would only get worse for Vicky when she moved to Berlin, with her in-laws intent on making Vicky's life a living hell. Frederick's uncle, King Frederick William IV of Prussia, was not happy with the match, and he made it known through his actions. He gave the young couple a derelict wing of the Berlin Royal Palace. It was outdated and in disrepair. Vicky received a cold welcome from her new homeland, and high expectations of her duties were placed on her shoulders. She was expected to attend formal dinners and events almost every night, staying up past midnight before waking up at dawn to greet guests. In order to fit in with her new family, Vicky had to do things their way, oftentimes placing herself in her mother's wrath. When the Duchess of Orleans, a relative of both Vicky and Frederick, died, Vicky had to make a decision that would damn her no matter what she chose. The Prussian court mourned for a week, while the British court mourned for a month. Vicky chose to follow the Prussian court, and Queen Victoria berated her daughter for not following the English traditions, sending many demanding letters to her daughter, only stopping at the behest of Prince Albert. Vicky loved to garden and hoped to continue to do so in Prussia. She began to use English techniques on the gardens of her new home, but insulted the Prussian gardeners' gardening skills while doing so. Despite being members of the royal family, Vicky and Frederick struggled financially. The king gave Frederick an allowance, but it was not enough for the couple to make ends meet, as they were expected to dress finely. Vicky had to dip into her own dowry. Like her mother, Vicky had many children. Within a year of marriage, she was pregnant, and in January 1859 she gave birth to her first child, a son named Willem. Her first delivery was traumatic. The maid delayed getting a doctor when Vicky went into labour, and Vicky nearly died during the delivery. Her son was in the breech position, making the delivery long and difficult. Eventually her son was born, but with a nerve injury to his left arm, which left Willem with Erb's palsy. Vicky was embarrassed by her son's disability and felt it reflected badly on her. When she saw the extent of her newborn's disability, the doctors tried to console the princess, telling her that the arm would heal. It didn't, and by the time Willem was an adult, his left arm was much shorter than his right arm. Vicky went to extreme lengths to try to cure her son's disability, not wanting to accept her son as he was. She would tie his uninjured arm behind his back, hoping that by restricting that arm, he would have to use his left arm. Wilhelm was also subjected to electrotherapy almost every day of his young life, and animal baths, in which his left arm was placed in the body of a freshly slaughtered hare. These treatments were abusive and did not cure nor help his condition. They caused the prince great distress, and he grew to hate his mother. Vicky went on to have a further 7 children: Charlotte, Henry, Sigismund, Victoria, Valdemar, Sophia and Margaret. None of the other births were as traumatic as her first. In 1861, her father died suddenly at the age of 42, plunging her mother into deep mourning for the rest of her life. Vicky was devastated at the death of her beloved father, and she returned to Britain to comfort her grieving mother and family, and also to attend the funeral. In 1866, Vicky's 4th child, Sigismund, died tragically at the age of 21 months, after falling ill with meningitis. She received little support from those around her, and Vicky was left to mourn for the loss of her child by herself. Her youngest, Valdemar, would also tragically pass in 1879 at the age of 11, again receiving very little support from the Prussian court. One of Vicky's decisions would go on to have catastrophic consequences for Prussia, although that would not occur until well after Vicky's own death. She hired a tutor for her children, and Willem was influenced by him, believing in his own divine right to rule autocratically, which influenced how he would later rule in life. The people hated Vicky, and she tried everything to get them to like her. She set up a military hospital to tend to the wounded during the endless conflict that plagued her country. But the king demanded that she stop her theatrics of charity. Nothing she did would make the people like her, as she and her husband were liberal and the German people were not. Vicky's husband's health began to fail. Frederick had issues with his throat, and it would swell to the point where he had difficulty talking and breathing. The doctors diagnosed him with a cancerous tumour, recommending that he have it surgically removed. Despite the advice, Frederick and Vicky refused any treatment, which caused outrage amongst their surviving children. William travelled to see them and accused his mother of being happy that her husband was dying. Frederick's father, William I, died on the 9th of March 1888, and Frederick became Frederick III. Frederick was more of a shadow king, as he was gravely ill and would not be king for long. Vicky wanted to protect her legacy, knowing that once her son became king, he would destroy her reputation. She had boxes of her letters sent to Windsor Castle in Britain for safekeeping. Frederick ruled for only 99 days, dying on the 15th of June 1888. William became king and immediately betrayed his mother. He had her private residences ransacked and searched for incriminating information. Nothing was found due to Vicky's quick thinking. Vicky was excluded from court and worked for charitable organisations like the Red Cross. By 1898, her health had begun to fail. Vicky was suffering from terminal breast cancer, and she devoted her final years to art and spent long hours writing letters. Her illness often caused her to spend long hours in bed. Only months after her mother's own death, Vicky passed away on the 5th of August 1901. She was buried beside her husband in the Royal Mausoleum at Potsdam. The life of Alice, Grand Duchess of Hesse and by Rhine. Princess Alice was born on the 25th of April 1843 in Buckingham Palace. After having their first son, her parents Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, as well as the public, eagerly awaited the arrival of a second son. However, this was not to be the case. The Privy Council even sent her father a letter of congratulations and condolences on the birth of their second daughter. Alice's life was not one you would imagine a princess would have. She was educated in a strict regime and wore humble clothing. Their rooms were constantly cold due to her mother loving the chill. Alice was extremely empathetic compared to her siblings, and she got on well with all of them, especially her older siblings Vicky and Bertie. Alice wanted to experience what life was like outside the confines of the royal household, and would often visit the working tenants at Balmoral. One day she escaped her governess and attended a local church. Though one of the gentler siblings, she was known to have a temper and would lash out at her siblings when they annoyed her. Queen Victoria was keen that her children would marry in love matches, but only from the upper class or royalty. Alice's sister Vicky, who had recently married, compiled a list of eligible royal bachelors, only finding 2 men suitable: William, Prince of Orange, and Prince Albert of Prussia. The family of the Prince of Orange were beside themselves with happiness at the prospect of him marrying an English princess. However, Alice did not like either man. After the 2 choices had crashed and burned, Vicky started to look for another match for her sister, and she landed on Prince Louis of Hesse. Queen Victoria invited him to Windsor Castle, and the couple hit it off. They loved each other's company, and Louis asked for her autograph as a keepsake. Queen Victoria started to make plans for the couple to wed, but then tragedy struck. Her grandmother died. Alice had nursed her grandmother to the end. She felt great sadness at the loss of her grandmother, and she had been close to her. Alice became the family caregiver, and she comforted her mother. In November 1861, her father became seriously ill, and Alice took on the role of caring for him. By December, all hope was lost, and Prince Albert passed away on the 14th of December 1861. The fallout of his death plunged the royal family into a deep mourning. While still in mourning, Alice continued to plan her wedding, and the Queen insisted that the wedding go ahead. The wedding occurred on the 1st of July 1862. It was not a fairy tale wedding. It should have been the happiest day of Alice's life, but it was more of a nightmare. Her wedding was downsized from a church to the dining room of her childhood home. She was also expected to change back into black mourning clothes once the ceremony ended. The Queen made the wedding about herself, and her sons had to stand in front of her to shield her from prying eyes during the ceremony. The Queen noted that it was more of a funeral than a wedding. Alice moved into Louis' home in Darmstadt. Crowds welcomed her with cheers, and she wrote to her mother that she had never received such a hearty welcome before. Though happy with her new home, Alice was homesick. Queen Victoria had envisioned Alice would get a newly built palace, but that was not to be the case. Louis's father had inadequate and dwindling finances, and he refused to waste what little income he had to build the newlyweds a new home. Instead, Alice and Louis lived in a simple house overlooking the old quarter of Darmstadt, a far cry from a palace. Despite this, Alice tried to make her lodgings as homely as possible. Alice became pregnant soon after the wedding and gave birth to a total of 7 children throughout her marriage: Victoria, Elizabeth, Irene, Ernest, Louis, Friedrich, Alex, and Marie. Alice was passionate about breastfeeding, and she experienced resistance from her mother, who hated the thought of her daughters doing this. In 1870, Alice gave birth to her second son, Friedrich, and soon after the birth, she came to realize there was something wrong with her son. Her son had hemophilia, a genetic condition that prevents blood clotting. Alice was a carrier and passed it on to her son. She also passed the gene on to 2 of her daughters, Irene and Alex, who were carriers as well. Everyone feared that Friedrich would pass soon, and he would die in a devastating way. On the 29th of May 1873, the boy fell out of a window. This fall could have been fatal for any child, and for Friedrich it was. He did not die on impact, and the doctors tried their best to control the bleeding, but he passed away, leaving his parents heartbroken. Alice was plagued with grief for years, and she never got over the loss of her youngest son. To cope with the loss, Alice kept her only living son close. At this time, her marriage was also not in the best state. Louis was a kind man, but he was emotionally stunted, and he was unable to offer much support to his struggling wife. She was disappointed in her husband's response to their son's death. She became increasingly full of resentment, and she was not afraid to let him know. She wrote to him to confess how she was feeling. In 1877, Louis's father passed away, and Louis became the Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine. Alice became the Grand Duchess. She struggled with her new role and wrote to her mother for advice. Her concerns fell on deaf ears as her mother belittled her. The end was near for Alice. In November 1878, Alice's oldest daughter, Victoria, complained of a stiff neck. It would soon become clear that Victoria had contracted diphtheria, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in the Victorian era. Initially, Alice was able to dodge the infection. All but one of her children fell ill with the disease. Elizabeth was the only member of the family to not fall ill, and she was sent away to live with her paternal grandmother for the time. Louis also fell ill with diphtheria. On the 15th of November, Marie, Alice's youngest child, died of the disease. Alice tried to keep it a secret, as she did not want to dampen her loved one's spirits as they were also fighting the disease. She eventually informed her son, Ernest Louis, who was so crushed by the news that he required his mother's comfort. Despite introducing a strict no-contact order in the house, Alice went against this and kissed her son's forehead. This was to prove fatal. By December, Alice became seriously ill with diphtheria, and in the early hours of the 14th of December 1878, Alice whispered her final words, "Dear Papa," and passed away. She had died on the anniversary of her father's death. The life of Princess Helena of the United Kingdom. One of the least remembered children of Queen Victoria, much of what we know about Helena comes from her mother's diaries. Helena was born on the 25th of May, 1846. Her birth caused much panic as she was born blue. Thankfully, she quickly recovered and was a mostly healthy child. As she grew up, Helena had to fight for attention amongst a brood of 8 siblings. This strengthened her character, and she even punched one of her brothers on the nose when they teased her. Helena grew up to be quite competitive and wanted to be the best at everything. She had many talents. She was an avid piano player, rode horses, and could draw. She also learned how to cook, clean, and farm. For the most part, her childhood was relatively happy, and she spent much time with her parents compared to other royal children of the time. However, in 1861, her happy childhood would end when her father, Prince Albert, died. Her mother became so grief-stricken that she made her children's lives unbearable. The children living at home moved to Osborne House and had to keep their grieving mother company. Despite expecting support from her children, Queen Victoria gave very little support to her grieving children, who had just lost their father. Helena found this time especially lonely. She was more sensitive than her sisters and was quick to burst into tears at the slightest bit of drama. For this reason, her mother chose Helena's younger sister, Louise, as her assistant and her older sister, Alice, as her secretary. In 1862, Princess Alice married, and Helena replaced her as her mother's secretary. She excelled at the role and became a good companion for her mother. With little affection and support from her family, Helena found support in Karl Ruland, her father's former private secretary. Helena came to love him, and when her mother found out about the affair, Victoria fired Ruland, sparking furious rows between the mother and daughter. Victoria was keen to have her daughter married off to avoid any more scandals. Helena was not deemed conventionally beautiful, and being the middle child in a large brood of children made her marriage prospects less secure. Her mother also had a condition for any marriage, that Helena had to stay in England near her mother, which made finding her a husband all the more difficult. Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein was chosen as Helena's husband. He was much older than her and came from poor connections. His family's duchies were being fought over by Prussia and Denmark. The possible marriage caused much division in the family, with several members being against the match for various reasons. Despite this, Christian and Helena were extremely happy together. The Queen put her foot down and the wedding went ahead on the 5th of July, 1866. Helena and her husband had a quiet married life together. He was the perfect husband, and they devoted themselves to each other. True to her word, Helena stayed close to her mother's residence, but found her role as secretary increasingly difficult, especially when she became pregnant. She had 6 children: Christian Victor, Albert, Helena Victoria, Mary Louise, Harold, and a stillborn son. Unfortunately, her 3rd son, Harold, died 8 days after his birth, plunging the parents into immense grief. Helena conceived soon after and gave birth just under a year later to a stillborn son. Helena felt that the world was against her and the couple had no more children. The numerous pregnancies took their toll on the princess's health, and she was often unwell, something her mother was unsympathetic about. Victoria believed that her daughter was just a hypochondriac. However, this was far from the case. Helena suffered from rheumatism, joint pain, and severe congestion of her lungs. Some of her lifestyle choices certainly didn't help this. She became addicted to opium to cope with her pain. Most of the time, Helena refused medical attention if she could help it, and she was possibly suffering from PTSD from the trauma of losing her father and 2 sons. Tragedy would strike her family again when her elder sister Alice died from diphtheria in 1878. Though different in many ways, Alice and Helena were there for each other when it counted, and the death of her sister hit Helena particularly hard. Receiving no support from her mother pushed Helena closer to her husband, and they built a life together, spending much time together. In 1887, Helena became the president of the British Nurses Associations, and she used her influence to support the idea of creating a nurses' registry to improve the education and status of nurses at the time. By this point, her opioid addiction was causing much concern in her family. Her mother, who was never concerned about her child's health, was very much worried about Helena. Christian became increasingly worried and begged the doctors to stop giving his wife the drugs. The doctors did so, and when Helena found out, she was furious. She was unable to get the drugs she needed and went into withdrawal, becoming extremely ill. Helena eventually overcame her addiction, and this should have been celebrated, but it was overshadowed when her eldest son, Christian Victor, died. Helena was proud of her children, especially her eldest, who was a major in the British Army. He was often in battle and far away from home. When he left for a trip in South Africa, he caught malaria and died in October 1900. Helena took the news as well as could be expected. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died. Helena and her youngest sister, Beatrice, comforted their mother on her deathbed and each other when she later died. With her death marked the change in the family's dynamics. One by one, Helena lost touch with her siblings, but the loss of her eldest brother, Edward VII, also known as Bertie in the family, hit her especially hard. Bertie and his wife Alexandra kept her at arm's length. Alexandra never forgave Helena for the betrayal of Helena marrying her husband Christian, whose territories were being fought over by Alexandra's homeland of Denmark. Alexandra got her revenge though. Helena was passionate about nursing, but Alexandra decided that she too was interested in the cause and demanded the position of president. Helena had to give up the position to Alexandra, who ranked higher than her in the order of precedence. Her brother would die in 1910, and 4 years later, Britain and Europe would be plunged into war. Helena's only surviving son fought for the Prussian army. She lost contact with him. None of Helena's children had gone on to have children in marriage, and only her daughter, Princess Mary Louise, married. Helena was upset at never becoming a grandmother, but little did she know that she actually had a granddaughter. Albert had fathered a daughter called Valerie Marie with a woman of high noble birth whose name is unknown. It is not clear whether Helena knew of Valerie Marie or not. Christian and Helena celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1916. The first couple in the British royal family to celebrate this milestone. He would pass a year later. Their marriage, that had been so opposed, had stood the test of time. 6 years later, in 1923, Helena fell ill, and on the 9th of June 1923, she suffered a fatal heart attack and died. The life of Louise, Duchess of Argyll. Born on the eve of many European revolutions, Louise certainly showed herself to be a strong, opinionated individual. She was born on the 18th of March 1848 and was the sixth of 9 children born to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Her birth was assisted with chloroform, a controversial pain relief at the time. From an early age, Louise was a firecracker who was almost too curious for her family. She was prone to asking questions, so much so that she earned the nickname Little Miss Y. Her rebelliousness only developed further as she grew older. When Louise was just 13 years old, her father, Prince Albert, passed away. The death of her father was extremely hard for the princess. Her mother was engulfed in her own grief and did not give any support to her children. Louise felt very alone, unable to get the help she needed for her grief. For 4 years, Louise and her siblings remained at home, out of the eye of the public. When Louise turned 17, she hoped to enter society. Grand balls were a huge part for the Victorian elite, and when a child came of age, they would have a coming out ball. Louise was expecting to have a grand ball, but was disappointed and furious when her mother cancelled the occasion. Queen Victoria decided that mourning for Prince Albert was more important, and no one was allowed to have fun in her presence. Despite having a stormy relationship with her mother, Louise and her mother worked together. Louise was her assistant and later secretary. Louise found the work boring, but found entertainment elsewhere. Rumours began to spread that Louise was involved in an affair with her younger brother's tutor, Robinson Duckworth. The Queen found out and dismissed the tutor. Louise despised her mother's endless rules and protocol, and so she ventured out into the world. She became a famed artist, learning her skills from the National Art Training School. She became a sculptor in a time when it was considered unladylike for a woman to sculpt. Louise rebelled against the status quo. Louise was connected to several men during her life. She was the Victorian ideal of a beauty, and she was often called the Queen's most beautiful daughter. So it is no surprise that men were falling for her. At 18, Louise had an affair with Walter Stirling, one of her brother's tutors, and it was rumoured that Louise became pregnant from this affair. Unmarried, this would have caused real concern for the royal family, and would have damaged Louise's reputation. The man who started the rumour was Charles Locock, the man who had delivered all of the Queen's children. Locock's son, Frederick, adopted the baby, named Henry, in 1867, which at the time was a very strange thing for an unmarried man to do. Frederick also received a large allowance and was given an apartment in St. James's Palace. Henry Locock's descendants have applied for permission to test the DNA of Henry's coffin to that of Tsarina Alexandra of Russia to check for a match, but they were refused, meaning the truth will never be fully known. Louise felt passionately about serving the ordinary British people. Using her influence as her mother's secretary, Louise helped to open a children's hospital and became the face of royal philanthropy. Though Louise was able to enjoy her 20s, the expectations of marriage was looming over her. The Queen was set about finding her a husband. Louise did not want to marry royalty, as she already had to struggle with her own royal family and did not want to deal with another royal family. Louise grew close to a man by the name of John Campbell. Though not a prince, he was from the nobility. Much of her siblings were against the match, but the Queen saw sense and allowed her daughter to wed John. The couple married at St. George's Chapel on the 21st of March 1871. For the first time since Henry VIII, a person of royal blood had married a member of the British nobility. This caused intense curiosity and huge crowds formed outside the church. Policemen were called in to form barriers to keep control. The couple honeymooned in Surrey before residing in Kensington Palace. Campbell was chosen by the Prime Minister in 1878 to be Canada's Governor-General, and the couple moved to Canada for the job. During her time in Canada, Louise promoted the founding of the National Gallery of Canada and the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. The people of Canada loved her, and the province of Alberta was named in her honour. In 1880, Louise was involved in a sleigh accident. The carriage overturned and Louise was dragged through the snow for 400 metres. She sustained a concussion and a torn earlobe, but recovered. Louise had a good heart and used her wealth and influence to create a medical fund that could provide assistance to men fighting in the Northwest Rebellion. Her actions in Canada caused a bit of jealousy for her siblings, who were under the watchful eye of their mother and thus were trapped by the Queen's protocols. When Louise returned to Britain, she didn't receive much of a welcome. Louise was close to a few family members, one of whom was her brother-in-law, Prince Henry of Battenberg, her sister Beatrice's husband. She possibly got on too well with him, and people began to suspect that she was having an affair with him. We will never truly know for sure. When Prince Henry passed in 1896, Louise remarked that he was the greatest friend she had ever had and that she would miss him more than Beatrice. The affair rumours were fuelled further by her own marriage. Louise and John were not in a happy marriage, and they lived separate lives. John may have been gay, but Louise was fairly open-minded and didn't seem to care, as their marriage was built for convenience more than anything else. Something that Queen Victoria was unhappy with her daughter about was that Louise was a feminist. Louise was a very vocal supporter for the suffragette movement. Louise used her wealth to help ordinary people, especially widows. She would often pay for funerals so widows could give their husbands proper burials. When her mother was set to celebrate 50 years on the throne, a sculpture was being commissioned for the Queen. Louise wanted to sculpt the statue, but the Queen told her to submit the design anonymously and the best piece would be chosen. When Louise's design was chosen, people doubted that it was hers, but Louise proved herself to be a capable and talented artist. In 1900, John's father passed, and John became the 9th Duke of Argyll, with Louise as his Duchess. Though they didn't have a very loving marriage, Louise was dedicated to her husband. As they grew older, their friendship grew and flourished. John became unwell, and from 1911, Louise began to take care of her husband. He passed in 1914, and the loneliness and grief she felt was immense. Louise became close to her sister Beatrice as she got older. They were neighbours and lived in Kensington Palace in adjoining rooms. Louise lived until the age of 91, passing on the 3rd of December 1939. The life of Princess Beatrice of the United Kingdom. Beatrice was the youngest child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. As is often the case with the last-born child, she was treated as the baby of the family. Beatrice was born on the 14th of April 1857 in Buckingham Palace. Her parents spoiled her, and her mother, who was notorious for finding babies ugly, found Beatrice to be beautiful. With an age gap of 4 years between her and her next sibling Leopold, and an age gap of 16 years between her and her eldest sibling Vicky, Beatrice was not very close to her older siblings, and as her siblings married, her home became lonelier. When Beatrice was only 4 years old, her father died, and her mother became dependent on Beatrice for emotional support, something a young child should never have to do. Queen Victoria would often take Beatrice from her bed and wrap her in her father's nightclothes and have Beatrice sleep beside her. After 1871, with all her sisters married, Victoria relied heavily on Beatrice for support. She became her mother's secretary, and during a period of illness in 1871, Beatrice wrote diary entries for her mother as her mother dictated out loud. Although the Queen was against her youngest daughter marrying, a number of suitors came forward. Napoleon Eugene, the French Prince Imperial and heir of Emperor Napoleon III of France, grew close to Beatrice, and rumours began to circulate of a possible engagement between the two. These rumours ended with Napoleon's death in 1879. Beatrice was devastated at the loss and received much support from her mother. Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, was also suggested as the possible husband for Beatrice. He was the widower of Beatrice's sister Alice, who had died in 1878. However, this was forbidden by law, and so it never happened. Other candidates, such as Prince Alexander and Prince Louis of Battenberg, were rejected. Prince Louis of Battenberg married Beatrice's niece, Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine. During the wedding, Beatrice met Prince Henry, the brother of Louis, and they fell in love. Upon returning to Britain, Beatrice expressed her desire to marry Henry. She was met with silence from her mother, and the two did not talk for 7 months, only communicating by note. Only after being persuaded by Beatrice's sister-in-law, the Princess of Wales, and her sister, the Crown Princess of Prussia, did Victoria begin to talk to her daughter again. Victoria consented to the marriage only on the condition that Beatrice and Henry remain in Britain close to the Queen. Beatrice and Henry married each other on the 23rd of July 1885 in St. Mildred's Church in Osborne. After a short honeymoon, Beatrice and Henry returned to the Queen. The longer they were married, the stronger Beatrice's love for Henry grew. The English court grew brighter and happier after the wedding of Princess Beatrice and gave Victoria a new lease of life. Henry was determined to take part in the military, which annoyed the Queen. She was opposed to his participation in the army. Henry felt oppressed by his mother-in-law, especially when she sent a warship to bring him back to England after he went to Corsica with his brother Louis. Beatrice continued to work as her mother's secretary. The Queen criticised Beatrice when, a week before she gave birth to her first child, she chose to eat in her rooms rather than with the Queen. Beatrice used chloroform during her deliveries and gave birth to 4 children: Alexander, Ina, Leopold and Maurice. Henry was bored by the lack of activity at court and longed for employment. In response, the Queen gave him the position of Governor of the Isle of Wight, but this was not enough. He pleaded to be allowed to join the Ashanti expedition fighting in the Anglo-Ashanti War, and eventually the Queen allowed him to. Only a month later, in January 1896, Henry died of malaria. Despite her grief, Beatrice remained her mother's companion, and Victoria tried to comfort her daughter. The Queen knew her daughter needed a place of her own, and she gave the Kensington Palace apartments, once occupied by the Queen and the Duchess of Kent, to her daughter. Beatrice's life was forever changed when her mother died in 1901. Her position at court was diminished. She was not close to her brother Bertie, who was now Edward VII, and they often got into arguments. One such argument was when Bertie attempted to sell Osborne House. Queen Victoria had left Beatrice and Louise houses on the estate, and the selling of Osborne House would threaten their privacy. Bertie extended the land around their homes to compensate for their loss of privacy, and went on to give the house to the nation. From 1896 to 1944, Beatrice was the governor of the Isle of Wight. From 1901 until 1931, Beatrice edited her mother's diaries, something that greatly distressed George V and Queen Mary. Her editing was done to protect those living, but also removed important information that would have been valuable from a historical standpoint to truly understand Queen Victoria's point of view in events. Beatrice continued to appear in public after her mother's death, but most of her engagements were related to her mother. Beatrice continued to live on the Isle of Wight in Osborne Cottage until Carisbrooke Castle, the home of the Governor of Isle of Wight, became vacant. She sold Osborne Cottage and moved into the castle. She also continued to live in Kensington Palace as well. In 1914, Beatrice's favourite son Maurice died fighting in the First World War. Another son, Leopold, died in 1922 from a knee operation, having inherited haemophilia and hemorrhage during the surgery. Beatrice eventually withdrew from public life and lived her last days in Brantbridge Park in Sussex. She passed away on the 26th of October 1944, the last child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to die.